Montgomery stood over the map like a man staring at his own reflection. The war in Western Europe was finally breaking open. German armies were retreating. Paris was free. The front lines were no longer walls, they were seams. And Monty believed he could tear one of those seams wide open and end everything. He leaned forward and tapped a long blue line running through the Netherlands. "There," he said. "That is the road into Germany." The room went quiet. British and American officers crowded around the table, their eyes following his finger as it traced bridges, rivers, thin ribbons of highway. Every one of those lines was fragile. A crossing that could be blown, a town that could be defended, a place where everything could stop. Montgomery didn't talk about that. He talked about speed. He talked about boldness. He talked about destiny. "We don't need to grind through every German position," he said. "We leap over them. We take the bridges. We drive straight through. The war ends." Some of the officers felt it in their chests. End the war. Not next year. Not after another winter. Now. Eisenhower listened from the head of the table. He had spent months holding together an alliance that was starting to pull itself apart. British commanders wanted credit. American generals wanted speed. Everyone wanted to be the man who finished Hitler. Montgomery was offering him exactly that. A clean ending. A story. A miracle. An intelligence officer cleared his throat. "Sir, there are reports of German armored units near Arnhem. SS formations. They may be regrouping." Montgomery waved him off. "The enemy is in full retreat. They are broken. But the drop zones, they will be taken," Montgomery said. "Our airborne troops will seize the bridges and hold them. Then the ground forces roll straight through." Eisenhower watched him. He had seen that look before. The confidence of a man who believed the war was finally bending to his will. "How long?" Eisenhower asked. Montgomery smiled. 90 days, he said. Perhaps less. The room breathed in. 90 days. For men who had been fighting for years, it sounded like salvation. Orders began to move. Airborne divisions were alerted. Transport planes were loaded. Maps were printed and folded. Young paratroopers were told they were part of something historic, something that would end the war and send them home. At airfields across England, soldiers wrote letters. Some laughed. Some were quiet. Most of them believed they were stepping into a final, glorious chapter. None of them knew they were being dropped into a plan that depended on everything going right. Every bridge, every radio, every mile. One bridge failed, and the whole army would be stranded. One German unit in the wrong place, and the road into Germany would turn into a grave. Montgomery didn't say that. He said the war was about to be over. And because he was Montgomery, the victor of El Alamein, the general who had never lost, people believed him. The planes took off, and the gamble began. The sky over England was thick with engines. Hundreds of transport planes rolled down runways and lifted into the air, heavy with paratroopers, gliders, and the fragile machinery of Montgomery's promise. Inside the aircraft, men sat knee to knee, rifles between their boots, trying not to imagine what waited on the other side of the clouds. They had been told one thing: this will end the war. At a makeshift briefing room near the airfield, a British intelligence officer stood beside a map of the Netherlands, tapping river crossings with a wooden pointer. "These are your objectives," he said. "Bridges at Eindhoven, Nijmegen, Arnhem. Hold them until ground forces arrive." A young paratrooper raised his hand. "Sir, what about German armor?" The officer hesitated, just long enough to be noticed. "Intelligence suggests the area is lightly held." That was not true. German units, battered but far from destroyed, were regrouping near Arnhem. SS Panzer divisions were resting, refitting, licking their wounds. Some Allied reconnaissance flights had even photographed tanks near the very bridges Montgomery is planning to seize. Those reports never changed the plan. In Montgomery's headquarters, maps were covered in arrows. The road to Germany was drawn like a straight line, clean, simple, inevitable. One of his staff officers pointed at Arnhem. "Sir, if the Germans are stronger there than expected—" "They won't be," Montgomery said. He believed speed itself was a weapon, that if the Allies moved fast enough, the Germans wouldn't have time to react. It was a beautiful theory. It was also a gamble with tens of thousands of lives. On September 17, 1944, the skies over the Netherlands filled with parachutes. British, American, and Polish airborne troops dropped into fields, towns, and forests. At first, it looked like a miracle. Bridges were taken. German defenders were surprised. Radio messages crackled with success. Montgomery's plan seemed to be working. Then the German tanks appeared. At Arnhem, British paratroopers watched armored vehicles roll out of the trees. Machines they had been told did not exist. Their radios sputtered and died. Supply drops landed in enemy hands. A captain crouched in a doorway, shouting into a useless handset. "We're surrounded! We're surrounded!" No one answered. Across the river, Allied ground forces were still miles away, fighting their way up a narrow road already choked with wrecks and ambushes. The entire operation was balanced on one fragile spine, and it was beginning to bend. Arnhem burned. What had been quiet streets and red brick houses became killing zones almost overnight. British paratroopers took positions in shattered buildings, firing from windows and doorways as German tanks rolled closer, their cannons punching holes through walls that had sheltered civilians just moments before. A young lieutenant crouched beside a radio that hissed with static. He kept pressing the transmit key, hoping someone, anyone, would answer. "Sunray, this is Frost. We're cut off." Nothing. Around him, men were running out of ammunition. Wounded soldiers lay in stairwells and cellars, the air thick with blood and dust. German loudspeakers crackled through the smoke, calling on them to surrender. They didn't. They believed help was coming. Across the river, Allied armor crawled forward along a single narrow road that became known as Hell's Highway. Every mile was an ambush. Every bridge was a fight. Wrecked vehicles blocked the way, forcing tanks to halt while engineers worked under fire. Time bled away. At Montgomery's headquarters, officers studied maps that no longer made sense. The arrows were still there. The plan was still on the wall. But the reality on the ground was screaming that it was falling apart. A liaison officer stepped in. "Sir, the British airborne at Arnhem are surrounded. They're asking for reinforcements." Montgomery stared at the map. "They must hold," he said. "But they're being overrun." "They must hold." He refused to accept what was happening. To admit Arnhem was lost would mean admitting the gamble was failing. So the paratroopers were left to fight. In a ruined schoolhouse, a British sergeant tore open a final crate of ammunition. "This is it," he said. "Make it count." They did. For days they held ruins, street corners, and shattered houses against German armor and infantry. They fought until rifles jammed, until grenades ran out. And still, no relief came. Montgomery's promise was collapsing, one burning building at a time. By the fourth day, Arnhem was no longer a battlefield. It was a ruin. British paratroopers moved through smoke-choked streets that had once been homes and shops, now broken brick and splintered wood. Every building they held was another coffin waiting to be sealed. German tanks prowled the intersections, their engines growling like animals that knew their prey was exhausted. In the basement of a shattered house, a medic knelt beside a wounded soldier. "We're going to get you out," he said, even though both of them knew it was a lie. Upstairs, a corporal fired his last magazine through a hole in the wall, then pulled the bolt back on an empty chamber. He looked at the men beside him. "That's it?" No one answered. Across the river, Allied relief forces were still stuck miles away, bleeding along Hell's highway. A burned-out tank blocked the road. Engineers crawled forward to clear it under fire. Every delay meant another British paratrooper dying alone on the wrong side of the Rhine. In Montgomery's headquarters, the reports had turned grim. A staff officer laid a message on the table. "Sir, the airborne at Arnhem are requesting evacuation. Casualties are catastrophic." Montgomery read it, then set it down. "They must hold," he said again. An aide dared to speak. "Sir, there may be nothing left to hold." Montgomery stared at the map, at the arrow that was supposed to reach Germany, and said nothing. In Arnhem, the truth could no longer be avoided. German infantry flooded the streets. Paratroopers were captured, wounded, or killed. Radios went silent one by one. The men who had been promised glory were now fighting only to survive another minute. One officer tore up his maps and burned them in a helmet, watching the paper curl and blacken. "So much for the plan," he muttered. When night fell, what was left of the British airborne tried to slip away across the river, wading through freezing water under fire. Many drowned. Many were hit. A few made it back. An entire division had been shattered, and Montgomery's miracle had become a massacre. Arnhem did not fall in one dramatic moment. It emptied. British soldiers stumbled out of ruined houses with their hands raised, mud on their faces, blood on their sleeves. German troops moved through the streets with rifles leveled, stepping over shattered doors, broken radios, bodies still lying where they had fallen. The bridge that was supposed to carry the Allies into Germany stood above them, intact, a monument to what should have happened. A German officer stopped beside a group of exhausted paratroopers. He looked at them with something close to respect. "So much courage," he said, "for nothing." Across the Rhine, the survivors huddled in wet fields, wrapped in blankets, staring back toward a city they had been ordered to hold and then left to die in. A young corporal kept asking the same question to anyone who would listen. Where were the tanks? No one answered. In Montgomery's headquarters, the mood was brittle. A staff officer laid casualty lists on the table. 17,000, sir. Dead, wounded, or captured. Montgomery didn't look at the paper. He stared at the map, at the arrow that was supposed to reach Germany. "We achieved a foothold," he said. "The operation was largely successful." The room went quiet. An intelligence officer stepped forward, his voice tight. "Sir, the SS units at Arnhem were reported days before the drop. We had photographs." Montgomery cut him off. "That's hindsight." "No, sir," the officer said. "That was warning." Montgomery turned away. In London, reporters gathered in a room thick with cigarette smoke and anticipation. Montgomery stepped up to the podium and smiled. 90% successful, he told them. A bold and necessary strike. Some of the men in the room had sons in uniform. None of them asked about Arnhem. In a hospital ward miles away, a British paratrooper stared at the ceiling as a nurse changed the bandage on his leg. "They told us we'd be home by Christmas," he said. She didn't reply. The war went on. More men died. And the bridge at Arnhem stood exactly where it always had, untouched by Allied tanks.